Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hello, here we are for another episode in Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. A little while back, we decided to do a multi-episode series on the history of religious freedom in the United States because, at least in the museum's way of thinking, it is one of our greatest innovations and key to understanding the country's past and present and in ensuring a vibrant future. In this episode, we will be talking with Randall Balmer, a prize-winning historian and Emmy Award nominee, the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College, and author of America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. Randall, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So just to get terms right, I've heard from some that there is a difference between the phrase religious liberty and the phrase religious freedom. Some scholars think there is, some scholars think there isn't. What's your opinion? Are there significant differences here that we need to understand?
I'm not sure that there is. I don't know what the differences would be. Religious freedom and religious liberty sound like synonymous terms to me, but
Okay.
I'd be willing to hear arguments to the contrary.
I think a couple of scholars have said religious liberty is more connected to a person's own personal worship, and religious freedom is more of the legal framework. But they also always say in newspapers and books, they're treated synonymously. It's just in the nitty gritty of scholarly work, sometimes people talk about a difference. So, okay. I did mention that you wrote a book about the separation of church and state, about religious freedom. Give our listeners an idea of your professional connection to the topic, the history of religious freedom.
Well, it began really in graduate school when my advisor asked me to assist him on a project studying the relationship between church and state. And this, frankly, was not a topic that I'd thought much about before that time. But as I became involved in it, I became really persuaded that this was the key to understanding religious life in America, and even by extension, life in America much more generally. That is to say, I become persuaded through my studies and from my observations over the last half century or so that the First Amendment is, as I say in the title of the book, America's best idea. And it's America's best idea for several reasons, but the two principal ones are, first, the separation of church and state has shielded the government from the stain of religious factionalism, such as you had in Europe. And the founders were very well aware of the situation back in Europe, and particularly in England, where religion had become a very divisive force in those societies. And second, the First Amendment set up what I consider to be a free marketplace for religion in America, which has allowed competition in this marketplace. And that, I think, has given rise to all sorts of religious groups, but also overall a vibrant, salubrious religious culture that is unmatched anywhere in the Western world.
Okay. So you just sort of happened upon it from an invitation to do a project. Were you studying history or religion and history at that point?
I was a student in the religion department at Princeton University, but I also was taking most of my courses in the history department. So this has always been my interest, is the history of religion in North America. So that's how I came upon the topic.
Okay, great. So paint for us, if you will, the picture of religious freedom in the colonies before the founding. What did it look like?
If you look at the Atlantic seaboard in the 17th and 18th century, you find, first of all, a remarkable laboratory of religious diversity. You have the Puritans as well as the Pilgrims in New England, and they're two different groups. People often forget that. You have the Baptists and other religious groups in Rhode Island. You've got another band of Puritans in Connecticut. And then you get down into the middle colonies and you have this extraordinary array of religious diversity. You've got in New Netherland, which of course becomes New York, you have the Dutch Reformed Church, but you also have French Protestants known as Huguenots. You've got Quakers on Long Island. You've got some Lutherans up in the Hudson Valley. You've got some Catholics in the Mohawk Valley. And after 1654, you've got Jews in New Amsterdam. And so it's a remarkably diverse religious culture in New York or New Netherland. New Jersey, much the same. You've got Dutch Reformed. You also have Scots-Irish Presbyterians as well as Quakers. And you go west to Pennsylvania, William Penn's Holy Experiment, which is another experiment in religious freedom and religious toleration. All sorts of groups. Penn, of course, favored the Quakers because he himself was a Quaker, but he allowed other groups in, including a lot of German groups, Anabaptists, Mennonites. My favorite group, the Schwenkfelders, was there. Heading down south to Delaware, you've got Swedish Lutherans, as well as the Dutch Reformed Church, but Swedish Lutherans in what is now Delaware, English Catholics in Maryland, Anglicans, Baptists in Virginia, and then in the southern colonies, a lot of folk religion, as well as the Church of England, and also groups like the Moravians. And if you go even farther south from that to Florida, you've got Spanish Catholics. Of course, Florida wasn't part of the colonies that made up the United States originally, but I mention this to say that there's an extraordinary amount of religious diversity already at play in colonial America. So when the founders sat down and tried to figure out how to configure the new nation, particularly religion and politics, church and state, they drew on the ideas of Roger Williams, the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, who had argued for segregating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation.
Okay. The way you describe it, listing out all those denominations, makes it seem like it was inevitable that the founders had to put in some sort of religious freedom framework. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I think they saw that as the only course. And think about the logistics and the complications of this. If they had designated, say, the Congregational Church, which of course is the lineal descendant of Puritanism, as the state religion, well, that wouldn't have been terribly palatable to the Anglicans in Virginia. If they had designated the Baptists as the state religion, well, other groups, the Dutch Reformed, the Swedish Lutherans, and so forth, wouldn't have been happy about that. And if they'd chosen the Unitarians, everybody would have been unhappy with that choice. So they wisely decided not to have the government favor any one religious group. And in many ways, the crucible of that decision played out in Virginia, where Patrick Henry, the governor, who was very popular in Virginia, proposed that generic Christianity would be the state religion. That is to say, not any particular denomination, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, or Church of England. It would be generic Christianity. And this was headed for passage in the Virginia Assembly. And James Madison was able to secure a delay on the vote. And that's when he produces his memorial and remonstrance, arguing against any state religion. And fortunately, that carried the day, and that paved the way for Thomas Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom, and eventually for the First Amendment. So even generic Christianity was rejected by the founders as the state church.
Which could have been an approach, as Patrick Henry thought, and maybe covered all their bases, and maybe would have worked, but James Madison and Thomas Jefferson thought otherwise. Before the founding, we have this diversity of religious denominations, but there are things in law where there wasn't complete religious freedom. I mean, there was diversity of faiths and denominations, but there were things in the law that prevented certain people from being office holders and things like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people kind of blithely talk about America as being a haven for religious freedom. Well, it's true that groups like the Puritans came to the New World to practice their version of the faith freely, but at the same time, they wanted to shut down all other expressions of the faith in colonial Massachusetts. So, yeah, yes, religious freedom, but only for them, and everybody else was shut out. And other places tried that as well. But again, I think the kind of grassroots quality of religious life in the colonies led to a great deal of diversity, which had to be accommodated as the founders configured the new nation.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ideas and people. So, what to you, Randall, are maybe one or two of the most important ideas that were used in the establishment of religious freedom in the United States as defined in the Constitution, which is no religious test for office and the free exercise and non-establishment clauses? What were the ideas that our listeners need to understand?
Well, the people who are more philosophically oriented than I am, we're talking about the influence of John Locke and other thinkers on the founders, and I think that's unmistakable. Certainly, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson were very well aware of those influences. But I go back to Roger Williams as being really the pioneer in this, and a quick biographical sketch is probably useful here. That is to say, Roger Williams had been educated at Cambridge University back in England, which at that time was a hotbed of Puritanism, came to the New World, and settled in as the pastor of the Puritan Church in Salem, Massachusetts. Very quickly, he ran afoul of the Puritan authorities because he criticized the close association that they were trying to make between church and state. That is to make the two, really, if you think about a Venn diagram, really concentric circles. That is, church and state would reinforce one another. And, that had been the pattern back in the old world, so it wasn't that radical an idea. But for the Puritans, again, as we said earlier, they wanted to exclude everyone else. And so Roger Williams descended from that. He was tried, convicted of diverse and dangerous new opinions, and was banished from Massachusetts, whereupon he made a winter pilgrimage to what is now Rhode Island and established there a haven of religious liberty. 1644, he writes a treatise called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, in which he introduces this metaphor, which has become so familiar to us today, where he talks about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation, a metaphor that was picked up by Thomas Jefferson and others sometime later. And I think it's important to point out that what we tend to miss in that metaphor, going back to Roger Williams in the middle of the 17th century, what we tend to miss is when he's talking about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. Roger Williams did not share our romantic notions about wilderness. For him and for his contemporaries, wilderness was a place of darkness, of danger, where evil lurked. And so when he talks about shielding the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his principal concern, I believe, was maintaining the integrity of the faith, lest it be compromised by too close an association with the state. So I think if any account of the founders and of this radically new idea, which it was at the time, of separating church and state has to go back to Roger Williams, the founder of the Baptist tradition in America.
Okay. All right, Roger Williams, any other actors that you want to identify as important?
Well, within the Baptist tradition that Roger Williams, again, founded in North America, you have other very important figures. You've got Isaac Backus, who was pastor of several congregations in New England, Massachusetts, who really railed against the idea of taxation of the general public to support any one particular religious group. In this case, of course, it was the Puritans, or now Congregationalists. He's an important figure. Another very important figure is John Leland, another Baptist preacher who had befriended Thomas Jefferson when both of them were in Virginia. And what I find really remarkable about Leland is he makes the point that religious freedom is more than toleration. Toleration, he said, is not good enough, because toleration always implies a kind of condescension. That is to say, I'm willing to let you practice what you want to practice. I'm willing to tolerate your religious beliefs, whereas religious freedom is on a plane of equality. That is to say, each group has its own legitimacy in the eyes of the law, and John Leland, I think, was very forceful in articulating that principle. And then when you come to the founders themselves, James Madison is certainly a key figure here. And one of his moments of real awakening on this issue was witnessing how Virginia was persecuting Baptist preachers. And he thought that was unfair, and he wanted to outlaw that. And he drafted the First Amendment, of course, to the Constitution, in which he encoded those 16 words, which I think are, I'll return to my little slogan, America's best idea. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that, I think, is, I'll say it again, America's best idea.
Yeah. Sounds like it feels like Baptists loom large in our religious freedom history.
It does. It does.
Yeah. Okay. You told us the story of Roger Williams, which is an amazing one, of his escape into the winter wilderness. Is there another story or two, favorite story or two during this effort to establish religious freedom in the U.S. that you'd like to share? A compelling story for our listeners.
I mentioned earlier John Leland, the Baptist preacher in Virginia. He goes up to Massachusetts, where he's pastor of a Baptist congregation in Cheshire, Massachusetts. In the presidential election of 1800, there was a very bitter election. We talk about politics today as being very contentious, and it certainly is at some level. But the presidential election of 1800 between John Adams, the incumbent president, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, was very, very heated and very contested. Jefferson wins the election, of course, out of Congress, and then what Leland wants to do is to show that even though all of New England voted for Adams, the Federalists, that Jefferson had some support in Massachusetts. And so he devises a scheme where he asks the people of Cheshire, Massachusetts, to bring milk from their dairy herds and form a mammoth cheese, which weighs something like 1,200 pounds. And that is inscribed with one of the Jeffersonian quotes. And they then transport this mammoth cheese all the way down to Washington, D.C., and present it to President Jefferson on New Year's Day, 1802. And that date is significant because on that same day, Thomas Jefferson sits down and writes his famous letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, assuring them of his support for the First Amendment and, to use Jefferson's words, the separation of church and state. So I love that story about the people of Cheshire, Massachusetts, producing this mammoth cheese that they presented to Thomas Jefferson in the White House. In making the cheese, they used a cider press to have a round of cheese big enough for them to make, and in summoning his people to contribute to this cheese, he made it clear that he did not want any Federalist cows contributing to this mammoth cheese that he gave to the president. I guess the other story that I'll mention briefly is in Connecticut, and as I'm sure you know, the last two states to disestablish church and state, that is to end taxpayer funding for any particular religious group, were Connecticut and Massachusetts. Connecticut in 1818 and Massachusetts in 1833. In Connecticut, in the run-up to the referendum that passed by a narrow margin in Connecticut in 1818, Lyman Beecher, pastor of the Congregational Church in Litchfield, Connecticut, was bemoaning this prospect that the Congregational Church would no longer be the state church in Connecticut. And he said, everything's going to go to hell. Morals are going to disappear. It's going to be a disaster if this passes. Well, the referendum passes, and in 1818, the Congregational Church is no longer state supported with taxpayer money. 2 years later, Lyman Beecher writes, "This is the best thing that ever happened to religion in Connecticut. We've got revivals all over the place, a great deal of religious enthusiasm," and he was careful to credit this to the disestablishment of religion in Connecticut.
Okay, that's a great story, as is the cheese. So can you give us our listeners, a few points on the timeline between the establishment of religious freedom in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the late 18th century, and then today, where it's developed, key points in that development that would help our listeners understand how we've gotten, what's happened between then and now?
There have been various attempts to subvert the First Amendment and disestablishment. The first major attempt to do so took place during the Civil War. When the Confederacy seceded from the Union, they made a big point of arguing that the United States Constitution did not include a lot of Christian language or any Christian language whatsoever. And so they pointedly included such language in the Confederate Constitution. And this raised a great deal of consternation among some people in the North, in the Union. And so a group of ministers primarily formed an organization called the National Reform Association. And it was headed by a man by the name of, I'm blanking on his name right now, I'll get it in a minute, who was a member of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And later, William Strong was his name. Later, he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Grant in 1870. So this was not a fly-by-night organization. This was a fairly weighty group. And they proposed an amendment that would add all sorts of Christian language to the preamble of the Constitution, crediting Christ as the ruler of the nations and all sorts of Christian language. They took their proposal all the way to Abraham Lincoln in the White House, who wisely temporized and said, "No, I don't think the work of amending the Constitution should not be undertaken lightly," and something to that effect, and said, in effect, "Don't call me, I'll call you," and wisely never got back to them about this. So that effort failed.
So the language in the Confederate Constitution, it sounded like, from your explanation, people in the North, or at least a group of people in the North, said to themselves, "Hey, we want something like that," right? But were there others who, when they saw that, were glad the federal Constitution didn't?
Yes. The proposed amendment from the National Reform Association had a lot of support, clearly, because a lot of people thought making the United States a Christian nation was a good idea, but it also engendered a lot of resistance. And so there were various petitions to Congress on both sides, on one side or the other, on this issue. But again, Congress wisely decided not to amend the Constitution to make the United States into a Christian nation.
Okay. All right, last couple of questions. Quickly, Randall, what do you think the American public gets wrong about the history of religious freedom? And then the next question will be, what do you think they get right?
There's a lot of misinformation out there these days. There's a whole group of people, organizations that are propagating the lie. I'll be explicit about it, that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation, or even that the founders, the majority of the founders, were something like evangelical Christians. And again, the historical record is very clear about that. The First Amendment itself is very clear. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. It's quite clear. The Treaty of Tripoli, that was ratified unanimously by the United States Senate on June 7th, 1797. Article 11 reads, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." And it goes on. Again, this was ratified unanimously by the United States Senate. So this notion that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation is just historically and demonstrably false. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans have been misled by this notion.
Okay. Anything that the public gets right in a general sense about religious freedom and its history?
I think Americans understand almost instinctively that religious freedom is a good thing. And if they bothered to poke around into our history, they would recognize that religion has always flourished in this country. And the reason for that, I'm persuaded, is the First Amendment, the fact that the government does not take sides on religious matter. The government stays out of this, thereby shielding us from the kind of religious contestation that was present back in England and Europe, but also providing for this free marketplace for religion. And again, I'm not sure that Americans understand all the details of that, but I think they understand that a sense of fairness and fair play would dictate that religious freedom is a good idea.
Okay. Great last question here, Randall. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or additional lessons or takeaways from the topic, religious freedom history, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
I think the history of religion in America speaks for itself, which is to say that we have a vibrant, vital, salubrious religious culture in America that is unmatched, arguably anywhere in the world, certainly in the Western world. And if you take the economic metaphor, which I think is useful here, that is to say, a free marketplace for religion, um, and look back historically, in 1776, Adam Smith, the economist in Britain, published a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is a brief for free market capitalism. And one of the examples he used was religion, arguing that if the state stayed out of the realm of religion, didn't try to regulate it, didn't try to favor one religious group or over another, that religion generally would flourish. And I think he was exactly right about that. I mean, I'm not going to agree with Adam Smith about everything in all of his preferences, but in that respect, I think he was absolutely right about this. Religion has flourished in this free marketplace. And frankly, those who want to undermine the First Amendment, and there are many people out there seeking to do so, the people who are undermining the First Amendment, I think, fail to recognize that they are actually working against their own best interests, that religion is flourishing precisely because of the First Amendment, precisely because of disestablishment. And any attempts to undermine that, I think, undermines the integrity of the faith, as Roger Williams predicted all those many years ago.
Okay, Randall, you have the last word. We have been talking with Randall Balmer, the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College and author of America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. Randall, thanks so much for being here. It was super. With what you shared with us, I think we are all equipped to be better stewards of religious freedom's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure.
And I should have said to all the listeners, go out and Randall did not tell me to do this, but his book, America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State, is short, succinct, and would be a really good read for anyone.
Persuasive, I hope.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private, digital-first National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek, and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.